Queen Camilla believed the private meeting inside Buckingham Palace would end with another carefully worded delay, another hollow promise, and another month of sitting beside a king who refused to face his own mortality. She was dead wrong. King Charles did not offer a speech. He did not negotiate. He simply lifted a heavy black fountain pen, pressed it onto a document titled the Coronation Continuity Decree, and signed his name, officially naming Prince William and Catherine as the absolute central figures of the Crown's next coronation era. Then, he quietly pushed the signed paper across the mahogany table. Camilla read the opening lines, realized her future authority had been stripped away in a single sentence, and broke down in tears. Before we go deeper into what this brutal decision really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. A suffocating silence pressed against Buckingham Palace. Charles kept his hand resting beside the royal seal, staring blankly ahead. William stood opposite him, rigid and tense, while Catherine stared at the parchment as if one single sentence had just rewritten every year of her life ahead. Two senior constitutional advisors remained near the closed doors, forbidden to let anyone in or out. The air inside the room was heavy, thick with the weight of an invisible handover that no official broadcast would ever fully capture. This decree carried the weight of law, but its deepest consequences were personal. While the present reign continued, Charles knew why the decision could no longer be delayed. His physical limits had begun affecting private briefings, long ceremonial days, and basic public duties. The Crown desperately needed a clear line of command if his strength failed. For months, quiet whispers had circulated among senior palace aides regarding the king's stamina during late-night constitutional reviews. The strain was undeniable. A sudden crisis without a clear blueprint would expose the monarchy to unprecedented turmoil. William understood the danger of waiting, but Catherine saw the human cost. She was being pushed into massive responsibility without a single moment to absorb the toll. Charles lowered his eyes, placed the fountain pen beside the seal, and looked directly at his heir. "From this moment, the future must no longer wait for me," he said. William did not answer. He looked toward Catherine, but she was completely stunned. She had entered believing the decree remained an unfinished draft, a broad discussion document meant to be debated over months, not an immediate command signed in ink. Across the table, Camilla's grief instantly sharpened into alarm. She gripped the edge of the table, rereading the clause that systematically stripped away her future authority. Her voice cracked as she demanded to know whether everyone else in the room had known before she arrived. Charles said nothing. That silence hurt far more than a direct confession. It proved that the decision had been made in total secrecy, far away from her private influence, shaped by advisors who viewed her presence as an administrative variable rather than a central figure of the reign. The Queen Consort turned the final page and found wording even Prince William had never seen. A secret revision, entered by the King himself earlier that morning, declared that her constitutional duties would officially conclude the moment the royal transfer began. Wiping her face, she demanded the last page be read aloud. Catherine moved toward her to offer comfort, but Camilla stepped back. Everyone understood what had just happened. The decree had not only opened a clear path for the next king and queen, it had quietly, permanently begun erasing Queen Camilla while she was still seated right beside the king. Hi viewers, if you were forced to choose between protecting your spouse's feelings or protecting your family's legacy, which one would you choose? Type spouse or legacy in the comments right now. I read every single reply. Camilla entered the adjoining room without looking back. She pulled at one glove with trembling fingers, failed to remove it cleanly, and asked her lady-in-waiting to leave. The woman hesitated, but the Queen repeated the request with a broken firmness that ended all discussion. A lady-in-waiting is a trusted personal attendant who supports a senior royal during private and public duties. Yet in that moment, Camilla wanted no witness, no comfort, and no reminder that palace walls carried every whispered secret. She stood alone by the tall curtained window, watching the rain strike the courtyard glass below. Decades of struggle, of enduring public backlash and institutional hostility seemed to dissolve into a single signed order. The royal household she had fought so hard to help build was moving forward without her input. Charles remained beside the long table, staring at the chair she had abandoned. He folded his reading glasses and admitted to William that he had known the wording would wound her. The king had waited most of his life to reign, and surrendering even part of that authority felt like losing years he had barely begun to possess. Yet uncertainty carried a greater danger. Without a prepared successor, one sudden absence could leave officials divided and public confidence shaken. The sovereign's health was no longer merely a private matter, it was the ultimate vulnerability of the state. Every delayed decree increased the risk of institutional paralysis. The king had chosen the harsh permanence of the crown over the private warmth of his marriage. William listened with his hands locked together. He had been prepared for kingship since childhood, but he never wanted his advancement to become proof of his father's decline. In fact, in a documented private exchange held 2 days earlier, the prince had urged Charles to remove the clause limiting Camilla's future role, warning that it would feel like personal rejection. He had cautioned his father that stripping her authority on paper would create an open wound within the family that no public display of unity could ever heal. He argued that constitutional transition must carry the language of continuity, not the cold phrasing of exclusion. Charles had ignored the warning. The king insisted that clear boundaries were required to prevent competing centers of power from emerging once his health inevitably forced a reduction in his schedule. Catherine stood near the window and spoke quietly. She told William they could not accept new authority, as though it were a victory. Every gain for them appeared tied to suffering elsewhere, the king's weakening strength, the queen's humiliation, and a family forced to prepare for loss before it had fully arrived. The weight of the crown was pressing down on them long before the ceremonial weight of the gold was ever placed upon their heads. William moved into the corridor, choosing the words he might say to Camilla, but stopped before knocking. The corridor was lined with portraits of former monarchs, figures who had faced their own brutal choices between personal affection and dynastic duty. From inside the room, he heard her voice tremble through a recorded conversation, later preserved by a senior court official. "They have already begun rehearsing a monarchy without me," she sobbed. The raw heartbreak in her voice echoed through the heavy door. It was the sound of someone realizing that despite every loyalty offered, despite every public storm endured beside the monarch, she was ultimately an official whose term had an expiration date written by the state. Catherine joined him in the hall, and neither spoke. They stood side by side in the silent hallway, fully aware that any action they took now would be scrutinized by history. Camilla's pain reached far beyond titles or ceremony. Before their wedding, Charles had made her a solemn private promise. Whatever pressure came, they would complete the reign together. Now, she believed his signature had broken it. That private vow had been her anchor during the darkest years of public disapproval. To see it undone by the same hand that wrote it felt like a betrayal that no palace statement could ever soften. To understand why the decree felt like ultimate betrayal rather than simple preparation, the story has to return to that promise, and to a hidden confrontation at Windsor 6 weeks earlier, where fear finally turned that promise into a weapon. Years before the decree was signed, Charles had given Camilla a handwritten promise inside the quiet rooms of Windsor Castle. It was simple. It was binding. Whatever storms surrounded their marriage, whatever hostility came from the press or the public, they would face the final chapter of royal life together. She carried that paper like a shield through decades of judgment. Yet one overlooked confrontation at Windsor changed everything. It lasted less than 15 minutes. It ended with a door closing softly. It became the point of no return that led directly to the tears inside Buckingham Palace. Charles had built his marriage around private loyalty. Whenever palace officials softened hard truths or buried danger beneath careful language, he turned to Camilla for the answer nobody else dared to give. That trust mattered because the king often stood between duty and emotion. She gave him the certainty to act. But that same blunt confidence slowly began colliding with William's team, especially over who should control major ceremonies, charities, and national appearances. 6 weeks before the signing, Catherine entered a succession briefing at Windsor Castle. She expected routine access to a confidential coronation rehearsal file. A succession briefing is a private meeting used to prepare the next generation for future royal duties if the present reign suddenly changes. Camilla refused. She closed a red dispatch box, a secure case used to carry official papers, and looked directly at the princess. "No future court will operate inside the present reign," Camilla said. Catherine stayed calm, but the insult landed deeply. She asked whether the restriction had come from Charles. The Queen held her gaze. "It comes from the Queen sitting in front of you," she replied. Then she dismissed the meeting and closed the door. That single sentence mattered because Catherine was already named in every serious continuity plan. Yet she had been treated like an outsider inside the very system she might one day be expected to preserve. The insult was not just personal. It was an administrative barrier thrown up against the inevitable arrival of the future. William learned about the confrontation that evening through his wife's documented account of the meeting. He went directly to his father, without aids, and warned that Catherine had been humiliated for simply preparing to serve. The prince did not demand Camilla's removal, but he insisted that fear could not be allowed to block constitutional planning. Charles listened in total silence. Then he asked to see the withheld file. The king's expression changed when he discovered that more than one document had been returned to Camilla's office. Several transition papers had been delayed under her authority. She had acted from fear, not ambition. She knew that once Catherine gained full access, courtiers might begin bypassing the present queen and treating her role as temporary. But Charles saw a deeper danger. Personal loyalty had begun obstructing the crown's future. That night, the monarch opened a blank draft and began writing the Coronation Decree in secret. Before continuing, he unfolded the old handwritten promise he had once given Camilla that they would complete the reign together. He placed it beneath the unfinished order and kept writing. Camilla entered the later signing meeting, completely unaware that William knew everything. When she finally learned he had carried the Windsor incident to Charles, sorrow hardened into fury. The confrontation behind the king's private door could no longer be stopped. Camilla did not wait for William to come to her. Still shaken, she crossed the private corridor herself and entered the king's sitting room without being announced. Charles was seated near the fireplace. Catherine stood beside a table covered with sealed papers, and William had barely begun speaking when the Queen turned toward him. Her voice was quiet, but the accusation struck harder than a shout. "You asked your father to remove me," she said. Camilla stayed near the doorway while William rose from his chair. Catherine stepped back, sensing the anger before another word was spoken, and Charles ordered everyone to sit. Nobody moved. The sitting room had become a private court, with no junior aides, no witnesses, and no formal protection. That mattered, because every sentence now carried the weight of family pain and constitutional consequence. The Queen accused William of turning one dispute at Windsor into proof that she had become an obstacle to the succession. She said he had taken Catherine's humiliation to the king and used it to weaken her place beside him. The prince held his voice steady. He denied asking for her removal and insisted he had demanded only one thing: that his wife be treated as a future queen, not a tolerated guest waiting outside locked doors. Camilla turned toward Catherine. She said the princess would inherit public sympathy, royal authority, and the ceremonial future she had spent decades fighting to reach. Catherine absorbed the accusation, then answered with quiet force. She told her that no crown could be protected by shutting the next generation out, and that preparation was not the same as replacement. Her words mattered, because one delayed transition could leave the monarchy divided during illness, while one public family war could destroy confidence before any handover began. Charles struck the arm of his chair with an open palm. The sound ended the argument. He declared that the Coronation Decree was his decision, written in his words and signed by his hand. He then revealed the hidden provision. Camilla would keep her title and dignity, but once the transition began, she would no longer approve future appointments, ceremonial plans, or household instructions. The king explained that 3 transition memoranda, official papers outlining future duties, had been delayed under her authority. Camilla stared at him, then removed her wedding ring and placed it beside the decree. She asked whether he still saw a wife, or merely another constitutional problem. Charles picked up the ring and walked toward her. William looked away. Catherine held her breath, but when the monarch reached out, Camilla stepped back. That single movement exposed the truth he had tried to avoid. Charles still held the crown, but power inside his family had shifted, and someone beyond that room had helped shape every line. The decree bore Charles's signature, yet its structure revealed the influence of a colder force, one that cared less about wounded marriages than constitutional survival. For weeks, a tiny group of advisors had been measuring risk, studying public confidence, and calculating how long the monarchy could function with 2 competing royal centers. At the heart of that calculation stood Sir Jonathan Mercer, the king's private secretary, holding a file that Camilla had never been allowed to see. Mercer had watched the tension grow in silence. As private secretary, the senior advisor who controls access to official papers, arranges constitutional guidance, and keeps family disputes from disrupting royal duty. He had seen Camilla's household and William's team issue competing requests over ceremonies, schedules, and succession planning. The conflict mattered because one unclear instruction could delay a national event, while divided authority could make the crown appear unstable at the exact moment it needed confidence. Before dawn one morning, the advisor entered Charles's study and found him still wearing the previous evening's clothes. The king sat alone with the unsigned decree open before him, reading the same paragraph again and again. He asked whether delaying the transition might protect the family. Mercer answered carefully. Delay would protect appearances, but it would deepen confusion inside the monarchy. Charles demanded proof. The private secretary opened a confidential assessment, a restricted report prepared for the sovereign, and showed him the pattern. Senior officials increasingly turned to William for long-term direction, yet they still sought Camilla's approval for present ceremonial decisions. Instructions collided. Meetings were rearranged. Important papers moved between two royal centres without a clear final voice. Mercer then explained why Catherine had been placed at the heart of the decree. Her presence would steady the prince, soften the transfer, and stop the decision from looking like a son reaching for his father's power. William needed her because duty without emotional balance could harden into ambition, while Charles needed the public to see continuity rather than defeat. The king alone still controlled the final choice. No advisor could force his signature. Yet the constitutional machinery, the network of officials and procedures that keeps the monarchy functioning, made one truth impossible to ignore. Refusing to prepare could expose the crown to a greater crisis later. Camilla confronted Mercer in a palace corridor after the signing. She asked how long he had known. In a documented private exchange recorded in his official meeting notes, he admitted that he had organized the decree's structure, but insisted the decisive paragraphs had come from Charles. The Queen's anger fell silent. She realized the meeting she had considered a family discussion was actually the conclusion of weeks of formal planning. Then Mercer revealed one final secret. A sealed appendix remained unpublished, and inside it was the exact date when William and Catherine would receive their first executive ceremonial authority. Before Camilla could demand to see it, the decree began changing the palace, altering invitations, cancelling instructions, and forcing everyone to decide which royal centre they would obey. By morning, the decree was no longer just a private wound. Its authority had entered the machinery of the palace. Meetings once chaired by Camilla were redirected. Briefing folders bearing her cipher were recalled. A coronation planning session was transferred to William's office before breakfast. Nothing had been announced publicly, yet every altered schedule carried the same message. The monarchy had already started moving toward its next center of gravity. Senior courtiers received sealed instructions. They transferred control of future coronation planning, national ceremonial rehearsals, and succession communications directly to William and Catherine. A cipher is the personal royal symbol printed on official papers to show whose household controls them. Camilla would remain queen and continue her present duties, but her office could no longer direct plans for the reign after Charles. The distinction mattered. Current service preserved her dignity, while future authority had now moved far beyond her reach. Camilla entered her morning office and stopped dead in her tracks. 3 red folders were missing from the center of her desk. Her equerry, a senior officer who manages a royal's daily official arrangements, explained that the files had been recalled under the king's signed authority. She dismissed him, locked the door, and pressed both hands against the hard wood of her desk. "Charles could have warned me," she whispered. "He could have spared me from learning this in front of servants." William received the first transferred briefing minutes later, but he refused to break its seal. He waited until Catherine entered the room. He feared that opening it alone would make every cold accusation against him appear true. The prince had gained real executive authority, yet it felt poisoned by his father's decline and Camilla's public humiliation. Success had arrived, but it carried the bitter taste of betrayal. Catherine opened the folder and read the cover page twice. She immediately ordered that none of the Queen's current engagements be cancelled or reduced. The princess understood why this mattered. Constitutional preparation could protect the crown, but public humiliation would turn necessary change into family punishment. William agreed, though both knew the palace had already begun choosing sides. One longtime member of Camilla's household submitted a formal resignation after being told future instructions required approval from the Wales office. Charles blocked it in a documented private order sent through his secretary. The king commanded the courtier to remain, refusing to let the decree leave his wife, surrounded only by empty rooms and obedient silence. Charles then walked to her office himself. He found the heavy oak door locked. A handwritten note hung outside, requesting that all official communication pass through her private secretary. He read it once, folded it carefully, and left without knocking. The final blow arrived that afternoon. William opened the sealed appendix and learned that he and Catherine were scheduled to begin their first joint coronation rehearsal within 72 hours at Westminster Abbey, the historic church used for crowning British monarchs. Camilla's name was completely absent from the directive. The rehearsal could have completed her humiliation, but before William entered the Abbey, he made a choice no advisor had ordered. It was a choice that forced Camilla to decide whether grief would become permanent war. William could have allowed the machinery of succession to carry him forward. Instead, on the night before the rehearsal, he walked alone to Camilla's private rooms and dismissed the security officer waiting outside. He brought no decree. He brought no advisors. He brought no prepared legal statement. When she opened the door, the future king did not bow or defend himself. He simply looked her in the eyes and delivered a single line: "I will not enter that abbey tomorrow while you believe I stole your place." Camilla let him inside and closed the door herself. She left William standing while she sat beside an untouched tray of tea. Her expression was guarded, exhausted, weathered by decades of royal battles. No aid remained between them. No secretary could soften a sentence that mattered. The succession had become painfully personal, and one false word could turn a constitutional transition into a permanent family rupture. William admitted that he had confronted Charles after the Windsor incident. He had defended Catherine and demanded that she receive the access required for her future role. But the prince insisted he had never expected the king to restrict Camilla so sharply or sign the decree without warning. He had wanted fairness for his wife, not humiliation for his stepmother. Camilla listened, then finally spoke without anger. Her deepest fear was not losing control of administrative files or national ceremonies. It was becoming a temporary chapter the family would politely close once Catherine occupied the place the public had already begun imagining for her. She feared decades beside Charles would be reduced to one difficult transition and one haunting image of a queen crying after power moved away from her. William did not deny their painful history. Instead, he told her that the king's reign, marriage, and legacy could never be honestly recorded without the years she stood beside him. Charles had depended on her through public judgment and private doubt. Erasing Camilla would mean erasing part of the monarch himself. The future king then placed a revised rehearsal order on the table. A rehearsal order is the official plan assigning each person's role during a royal ceremony. William had amended it under his new executive authority, giving Camilla a central place in the ceremonial handover rather than excluding her from Westminster Abbey. The Queen stared at the document and asked whether Catherine had approved. He answered that the princess had been the first to say transition must not require cruelty. Camilla's resistance finally cracked. She admitted that withholding the Windsor file had been wrong. Fear had pushed her to protect her position at the direct cost of Catherine's dignity. William told her she could refuse the revised role without punishment, but she knew what duty demanded. Elsewhere in the palace, Charles waited without knowing whether peace was possible. Catherine sat beside him and quietly said that neither marriage nor authority could survive without truth. Camilla lifted the pen and signed the acknowledgement. It was not surrender, it was acceptance that helping the future arrive might become her final, most powerful service to the present king. By sunrise, the family had reached a fragile understanding, but the palace could no longer contain the leak. At 6:17 in the morning, a national newspaper appeared with a stark front page, a black and white image of Camilla leaving Buckingham Palace beneath a terrifying headline, "The Decree That Changes the Crown." Within minutes, broadcasters abandoned scheduled reports. Crowds gathered outside royal residences. A private family rupture became a national argument about duty, succession, and sacrifice. The palace issued a formal confirmation. It stated that Charles had signed a constitutional continuity order with the full cooperation of William and Catherine, adding the line that Camilla would remain an essential participant in the handover. The Queen called Catherine personally and thanked her for preventing the announcement from becoming a declaration of defeat. Hours later, Charles, Camilla, William, and Catherine entered Westminster Abbey together. Inside the vast, quiet sanctuary, the private rehearsal began. A private rehearsal is a closed preparation in which royal participants practice the order, words, and responsibilities of a major ceremony before it takes place publicly. Charles entered first with Camilla walking beside him. William and Catherine followed several steps behind, deliberately refusing to move ahead as the original decree protocol had required. Their chosen formation showed the public that the future was approaching without pushing the present king aside. The Dean of Westminster handed Charles the rehearsal document. The king held the paper, turned toward William, and spoke without hesitation. "This authority is being prepared for you. It is not being taken from me." The prince lowered his head in recognition of the sacrifice behind those words. Camilla stood beside Catherine as the future coronation oath was reviewed. The oath is the solemn promise a monarch makes to serve the country and uphold the responsibilities of the crown. Then the Queen lifted the ceremonial briefing folder she had once locked away at Windsor and placed it directly into the princess's hands. Catherine accepted it with both hands. She quietly assured Camilla that preparing for tomorrow did not erase the service she gave yesterday. Charles reached into his pocket and returned the wedding ring Camilla had left beside the signed decree. He apologized for protecting the crown through secrecy instead of trusting his wife with the truth. The Queen accepted the ring, admitting that fear had turned preparation into resistance. No faction had won. No marriage had been destroyed. The family had simply learned the painful difference between love and power. Camilla's tears marked the end of one expectation. She could not remain at the center of both the present reign and the next. Yet by standing beside Catherine, she transformed loss into duty. Charles had protected the succession. William and Catherine had accepted its burden without triumph. And Camilla had discovered that her final act of influence was helping the family meet the future together. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss an insider update. Now, tell me what you think in the comments below. Did King Charles do the right thing by secretly signing the decree to protect the crown, or did he betray Queen Camilla when she needed him most? Type duty or betrayal right now. I am reading your answers. But if you think the signing of this decree settled the war inside the royal walls, you are drastically mistaken. What the public never saw was the second document hidden inside Sir Jonathan Mercer's locked brief, a handwritten codicil dated just 4 days after the Abbey rehearsal. It contains an unannounced executive order regarding Prince Harry, a private directive that fundamentally threatens William's absolute control over the upcoming reign, and a secret meeting at Highgrove that left Catherine in tears for an entirely different reason. In our very next video, We are uncovering the leaked text of that hidden codicil and the emergency late-night call that changed the succession forever. You cannot afford to miss a single second of what comes next. Hit that notification bell right now, and I will see you in the next story.